Jake Thompson had always loved the smell of soil after rain. Even as a boy, he'd spend hours in his grandfather's small field, helping plant tomatoes, watching bees hover over wildflowers, and learning how every seed had its own story. When he grew older, life took him far from the land. He spent years working in a noisy city, surrounded by tall buildings and endless traffic. Still, he never lost that quiet dream, to live on a piece of land where he could grow food with his own hands. After many years of saving, Jake and his wife finally found a home in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. The houses were neat, lawns trimmed perfectly, and mailboxes painted the same color. It was a place that seemed calm and organized, just what they thought they needed after city life. The neighborhood was managed by an HOA, something Jake didn't think much about at first. The idea of having community rules sounded fine. He figured they just kept things tidy and neighborly. When Jake moved in, he noticed the big backyard behind the house. It wasn't huge, but to him it felt like freedom. The soil looked rich, the sunlight hit it just right, and in his mind he could already see rows of green vegetables growing. After unpacking the last box, he told his wife, "I think I'll start a small garden, just a few plants to keep busy." She smiled, knowing that farming had always been his way of finding peace. At first, it was just that, some tomato plants, peppers, and a small herb patch near the fence. Every morning before work, Jake would step outside with his coffee, kneel by the soil, and check the leaves. The garden began to grow fast, and soon he added a few more rows. The backyard started to look different from the rest of the neighborhood, where most lawns were just grass and flower beds. Still, Jake felt proud. It reminded him of his grandfather's field, of long summer days when work and joy were the same thing. One weekend, while talking to a neighbor, Jake mentioned that he wanted to get a few chickens. "Just for fresh eggs," he said with a grin. The neighbor raised his eyebrows. "I'm not sure the HOA allows that," he replied. Jake laughed it off, thinking it couldn't be a big deal. After all, it was just a couple of hens in a small coop, not a noisy farm. So he built a simple wooden coop by hand, painted it white to match the fence, and brought home 3 brown hens. They were quiet, calm creatures who spent their days pecking at the ground. Jake loved watching them as he worked in the garden. It felt wholesome, natural, like life had slowed down just enough to be meaningful again. A few weeks later, Jake came home to find a letter taped to his door. It had the HOA logo at the top. Inside, the letter said he was in violation of community guidelines. The list included raising livestock, unauthorized structures, and non-conforming landscaping. It asked him to remove the coop and restore his yard to community standards. Within 14 days, Jake read the letter twice. He wasn't angry at first, just surprised. He didn't see his garden or chickens as a problem. He thought they added life to the neighborhood. Still, he decided to attend the next HOA meeting to talk it out. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a bright room filled with folding chairs and the smell of coffee. About a dozen neighbors sat in rows while the HOA board sat at a table up front. Jake waited his turn and then stood up, holding a few photos of his backyard. "I'm not running a farm," he said kindly. "It's just a garden and a few hens. They're quiet and I take good care of them. I think it adds value to our community." One of the board members, an older man with glasses, shook his head. "The rules are clear," he said. "No livestock of any kind, and all yards must remain landscaped in a uniform manner." Another board member added, "If we allow this, then everyone will start bringing in animals or tearing up their lawns." "It's a slippery slope," Jake tried to reason with them. He explained that his hens weren't noisy, that they didn't smell, and that the garden was well kept. But it was clear that the board wasn't going to change its mind. "You have until the end of the month," the chairman said, "or we'll have to issue fines." That night, Jake sat on the back porch, staring at the coop under the soft glow of the porch light. The hens clucked quietly inside, unaware of the trouble they'd caused. He felt disappointed, even a little hurt. All he wanted was a simple, honest way to live. He wasn't trying to break rules, he was trying to live meaningfully. His wife joined him with 2 cups of tea. "Maybe you should just take it down," she said gently. "We don't want problems with the neighbors." Jake nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the garden. "I know," he said slowly, "but it feels wrong to be told I can't grow food on my own land." Over the next few days, more letters came. The HOA warned that if the coop wasn't removed, they'd start adding daily fines. Jake could feel the pressure building. Neighbors who once waved at him now seemed distant, avoiding conversation. Still, there were others, quiet supporters, who whispered encouragement. One woman from down the street stopped by with her young son and said, "He loves seeing your chickens. They make this place feel alive." That small comment gave Jake a bit of hope. Maybe not everyone in the neighborhood agreed with the HOA. Maybe some people actually liked what he was doing, so he began to gather support. He made a short note explaining why he wanted to keep his small garden and hens, and he went door to door, asking neighbors to sign a petition. Many listened politely, some even signed, but a few people refused, saying things like, "Rules are rules," or "We moved here to avoid that kind of thing." When he presented the petition at the next meeting, the board barely looked at it. The chairman simply said, "This matter has already been decided." That was the moment something changed in Jake. He realized that the issue wasn't just about a few chickens. It was about control, about who got to decide how people lived on their own land. He left the meeting without another word, but a quiet determination began to grow in him. At home, he walked out to his garden, feeling the cool evening breeze. The setting sun cast a golden light over the rows of green plants. His hens scratched peacefully in the dirt, unaware that their days there might be numbered. Jake ran his hand through the soil, feeling its warmth, and thought about how hard it had been to find this bit of peace. He wasn't ready to give it up. Not yet. The neighborhood was calm that night, but inside Jake's heart something had started to stir. He didn't know it yet, but this fight with the HOA would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone living around him. For now, though, he just sat quietly, watching the garden he'd built with his own two hands, wondering how far he'd have to go to protect it. The days after the HOA meeting felt heavier for Jake. Every time he walked outside, he could feel eyes on him. Some neighbors gave polite smiles. Others looked away, pretending they didn't notice his garden anymore. The hens still clucked softly in their coop, unaware that they'd become the talk of the neighborhood. One morning, Jake found another letter in the mailbox. This one wasn't just a warning, it was a fine. The HOA was charging him for non-compliance with community standards. The amount wasn't huge at first, but it came with a message. If he didn't remove the coop within 10 days, the fines would continue daily until he did. Jake sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper. His wife placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Maybe we should just end it. It's not worth all this stress." He nodded but didn't speak. He knew she was right in a practical sense, but something deep inside him refused to accept that growing food or keeping a few chickens could be wrong. That evening, Jake took a walk around the neighborhood. He noticed how every house looked the same. Green lawns, trimmed bushes, clean driveways. It was beautiful in a way, but also lifeless. He thought about how much energy people spent maintaining appearances while nature was kept out, controlled or replaced with concrete and fake turf. When he returned home, he sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the trees. He made a quiet promise to himself he wouldn't back down easily. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. He was trying to live simply. There had to be a way to make that clear. Over the next few weeks, Jake tried to reason with the HOA again. He wrote letters explaining that his chickens were quiet and clean, that his garden helped him relax, and even fed a few neighbors who appreciated fresh produce. But the board didn't respond kindly. Instead, they sent more warnings and added more fines. One day, 2 HOA members came to his door. They wore neat clothes and polite smiles, but their words were sharp. "We understand you're passionate about your garden," one of them said, "but this community has rules. Everyone must follow them equally." Jake replied calmly, "I respect that, but isn't it strange that people can have plastic flamingos or stone fountains, but not living plants that feed us?" They didn't answer. They just handed him another notice and walked away. The next week, Jake noticed a few people taking photos of his yard from the sidewalk. At first he ignored it, but then he started feeling uneasy. It wasn't just about farming anymore. It was about being watched, judged, and controlled. The fines piled up and the HOA threatened legal action if he didn't remove the coop. His wife began to worry. "They're serious, Jake," she said one night. "What if they take us to court?" Jake sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I know, but it's not fair. This is our home, our land. We pay for it. We take care of it, and they're acting like we're criminals for growing food." He could feel frustration boiling inside him, but he didn't want to act out of anger. Instead, he decided to find out more about what gave the HOA so much power. He spent nights reading about property laws, zoning rules, and homeowners' rights. The more he learned, the clearer it became that HOAs often operated with more authority than most people realized. One Saturday morning, while searching online for similar cases, Jake found stories of other homeowners who had faced the same kind of fight. People fined for planting gardens, building solar panels, or even hanging laundry outside. Some gave up, but a few had found creative ways to stand their ground. That's when an idea began to take shape in Jake's mind. He remembered seeing open land just beyond the neighborhood, a wide stretch of fields that used to be farmland years ago. He'd driven by it many times and noticed it was still unused. If he couldn't farm in his backyard, maybe he could farm somewhere else, somewhere the HOA had no say. The next day he drove out to that area and parked by the edge of the old field. The soil looked dry but healthy. The land stretched out beautifully, dotted with wild grass and a few trees swaying in the wind. He stood there for a while, imagining what it would be like to bring it back to life. After some digging around, he found out that the property belonged to an elderly farmer who had retired years ago. The man's children had moved away and the land hadn't been used in a long time. Jake decided to pay him a visit. When he arrived at the farmhouse, the old man greeted him kindly. They talked about farming, about how things had changed, and about how people seemed to have forgotten where their food came from. Jake shared his story, the garden, the chickens, the HOA, everything. The old farmer listened quietly and then said with a smile, "That land's been waiting for someone like you. I'd rather see it alive again than sold off for more houses." That conversation stuck in Jake's mind for days. He went home feeling inspired but also nervous. Buying land wasn't a small thing. It would take money, time, and risk. But the thought of being free from the HOA's rules, of farming on his own terms, felt worth it. Meanwhile, the pressure at home grew. The HOA began sending letters not just to him, but also to his mortgage company, threatening to place liens on his property if the violations continued. It felt personal now. The board members avoided direct conversation, but their actions spoke clearly. They wanted him gone or broken down. Jake didn't argue anymore. He just kept quiet, paid his bills, tended to his plants, and thought deeply about what to do next. One evening, as he stood in his backyard, a soft breeze rustled through the leaves. He looked out past the fences, past the manicured lawns, and toward the horizon where that open farmland lay waiting. A small smile appeared on his face. He didn't have a plan yet, but he had a direction. His wife noticed the look in his eyes. "What are you thinking?" she asked gently. Jake turned to her and said, "I think if they don't want me farming here, maybe I'll find somewhere they can't stop me." She gave him a long look, trying to read if he was serious. Then she said quietly, "Just promise me you'll be careful." Jake nodded. "I will. But I'm done letting other people decide what's right for us." As night fell, the lights from the neighboring houses flickered on one by one. The air was calm, but inside Jake's heart, there was a growing sense of determination. The fight with the HOA had pushed him into a corner, but instead of giving up, he was beginning to see a new path. He didn't know yet that this small spark of defiance would soon turn into something much bigger, something that would not only change his life but reshape the land around the entire community. Jake spent the next few weeks quietly planning. Every night after dinner, he would sit by his laptop looking over maps, reading about local farmland, and running numbers on a small notepad. The idea that had started as a spark was now becoming something real. He knew the old farmland surrounding the HOA was still for sale. He had met the owner, an older man who seemed happy to see it go to someone who cared about the land. Jake wasn't a rich man, but he was careful with his money. Years of working in construction and saving had given him enough for a decent down payment. He also knew how to build and repair things himself, which meant he could save on costs later. The decision wasn't easy. Buying farmland meant taking a risk. It meant stepping into something new, something the HOA couldn't control. One cool morning, Jake drove back to the old farmhouse to meet the owner again. The man greeted him with a warm handshake. They walked together through the empty fields, dry grass crunching under their boots. The sun was rising slowly, painting the sky orange and gold. The old man said, "This land's got good bones. You take care of it, it'll take care of you. Jake nodded, looking out at the wide open space. He could already imagine rows of crops, maybe a few greenhouses, a place for animals to roam free. It felt right, like this was where he was meant to be. A few weeks later, after paperwork, meetings, and a long wait for the bank, the sale was complete. Jake now owned the land that surrounded the very neighborhood that had tried to stop him. It was an unbelievable feeling, quiet, powerful, and strangely peaceful. When he told his wife, she was speechless at first. "You really did it," she said, half amazed and half nervous. He smiled. "Yeah," he replied softly. "Now we'll do things our way." At first, Jake didn't tell anyone in the neighborhood about the purchase. He went about his days as usual, tending his small garden and keeping things calm. But soon, trucks began showing up near the edge of the HOA property. Deliveries of tools, soil, fencing materials, and equipment. People started to notice. One afternoon, while he was unloading supplies, a neighbor stopped by and asked, "What's going on out there? Are they building something?" Jake smiled slightly. "Just fixing up some old farmland," he said. Word spread quickly. Some residents were curious, others worried. A few members of the HOA board called an urgent meeting. They speculated about what Jake was doing, but no one really knew for sure. Meanwhile, Jake spent his days working on the land. It was hard labor, digging, clearing old brush, fixing fences, and setting up irrigation lines, but he didn't mind. Every shovelful of dirt reminded him that he was building something that no one could take away. The sound of the wind across the open fields felt like freedom. After a month of work, green sprouts began to appear. The once empty fields started to show signs of life. Jake planted vegetables first: corn, beans, tomatoes, and lettuce. Then he added fruit trees along the borders and built a small barn from reclaimed wood. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. One day, while he was hammering boards into place, a couple of HOA members drove by slowly. They stopped near the fence line, watching quietly. Jake waved, but they didn't wave back. He could guess what they were thinking. The neighborhood, once surrounded by untouched land, was now surrounded by his farm. Soon the HOA sent a letter, not about his house this time, but asking for clarification about his activities on the nearby land. Jake smiled when he read it. The farmland was outside the HOA's legal boundary. They had no authority there. He folded the letter, put it aside, and went back to work. The following weeks were some of the happiest of his life. He woke up early, worked all day, and came home tired but fulfilled. His wife began helping too, planting flowers and herbs near the entrance of the farm. Together they made it a place of life and color. Slowly, people from the neighborhood started visiting out of curiosity. A few brought their kids to see the plants. One family asked if they could buy fresh vegetables. Jake welcomed them warmly. He didn't hold grudges. He just wanted to share what he loved. Before long, the empty land around the HOA had turned into a real farm. It wasn't a giant commercial operation. It was a community space full of green fields, buzzing bees, and laughter. Jake built a small stand near the road where he sold fresh produce, eggs, and honey. The sign read simply, "Local Roots Farm, fresh, honest, and homegrown." People began stopping by from nearby towns, buying food and talking with Jake. They liked hearing his story, how one man had turned rejection into something positive. Even those who once doubted him began to see things differently. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Some HOA board members complained about the smell of soil or the sound of tractors in the distance. But legally, there was nothing they could do. The farmland wasn't under their control. Jake had won, not through anger, but through patience and persistence. As the first harvest season came around, Jake stood at the edge of his fields one evening, watching the sunset. The golden light touched every corner of the land, the crops swaying gently in the breeze. He thought about how far he'd come, from being told no for planting a few vegetables to now owning the fields that surrounded the very people who had tried to stop him. His wife joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "Looks like you got your farm after all," she said with a smile. Jake chuckled softly. "Yeah," he replied. "I guess the best way to deal with a wall is to grow something around it." They stood there in silence for a while, listening to the wind and the faint sound of crickets. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about peace. He had taken something negative and turned it into something good, something lasting. That night, as he sat on the porch looking out over the land, Jake felt a calm pride. The HOA could keep their perfect lawns and matching mailboxes. He had something better, freedom, purpose. The neighborhood, once quiet and uniform, now had a heartbeat again. Families began visiting the farm stand regularly, kids learned where food came from, and people started talking to one another more. The farm had brought the community together in ways the HOA never could. Jake never said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. The land itself said it for him. Every plant, every tree, and every sunrise was proof that sometimes the best way to win a fight is not through anger, but through creation. And as he looked across his fields, Jake couldn't help but smile, knowing this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The farm grew faster than anyone expected. What started as a few rows of vegetables soon turned into acres of green life. The sight of growing crops stretched out around the neighborhood like a living painting. Every morning, the sound of birds, mixed with the hum of tractors and the rustle of wind through the leaves. It was peaceful, yet full of quiet energy. Jake woke up early every day, long before the sun came up. He'd make a pot of coffee, put on his boots, and head out into the fields. He liked that time of day, when the air was cool and still, and the sky was just starting to glow. He checked on his plants, fed the chickens, and waved to the delivery truck that came with feed and supplies. At first, the HOA tried to pretend the farm wasn't there. They sent a few more letters complaining about noise and traffic, but there was little they could do. The land was his, and it was outside their control. Slowly, they stopped writing altogether. The board members didn't want to admit it, but the fight was over. Something unexpected began to happen in the neighborhood. Families started walking out to the edge of the farm in the evenings. Children ran through the tall grass, laughing and chasing butterflies. Some of the older residents who had once complained about Jake's garden now came to buy fresh vegetables and chat about the weather. One afternoon, an elderly woman from the HOA knocked on Jake's farm stand window. She smiled shyly and said, "I used to keep a small garden before I moved here. It feels nice to see things growing again." Jake handed her a small basket of tomatoes and said, "Then you should come by more often." She did, and soon others followed. The farm became a quiet bridge between people. Jake noticed that neighbors who rarely spoke before were now talking to each other while picking up produce. Kids asked him questions about how plants grew, and he started teaching them simple things: how to plant seeds, water them, and care for the soil. He never planned for it, but the farm had turned into a community space. As the months passed, Jake decided to build a small greenhouse near the main road. He wanted to grow herbs and flowers during the colder months. He also added a few benches and a picnic area under an old oak tree so people could sit and enjoy the view. On weekends, local families came out to help, bringing snacks and stories. It wasn't just his project anymore. It had become something everyone shared. Of course, not everyone was happy. Some members of the HOA board still grumbled that the farm brought too much attention. They complained that cars from outside the neighborhood were coming to visit the farm stand. But even they couldn't deny that the area looked better than ever. The once quiet neighborhood now had a sense of life, of purpose. Ironically, the same HOA that had once fined Jake for planting vegetables was now benefiting from the change. Property values began to rise. Real estate agents even mentioned the beautiful surrounding farmland as a selling point. New families were moving in, drawn by the charm of the rural scenery mixed with suburban comfort. One afternoon, Jake was approached by a man from the city council. The man told him that people were talking about his story, how one person had brought life back to the land. He suggested that Jake consider opening his farm for educational visits or small local events. Jake liked the idea, but he didn't want it to turn into a business more than a way of life. Still, he agreed to host a few farm days where kids from nearby schools could visit and learn about growing food. The first event was simple. A few dozen children came with their teachers, walking through the fields with wide eyes. Jake showed them how to plant seeds and let them pick a few ripe vegetables. When they left, he saw something he hadn't seen in years: kids actually excited about dirt. It made him laugh. That night, As he sat on his porch with his wife, he told her, "It's strange, isn't it? The same thing that caused us so much trouble is now bringing everyone together." She smiled and said, "Maybe it was meant to happen this way." Jake nodded. Deep down, he knew she was right. The fight with the HOA had been hard, but it had also pushed him to dream bigger. If they hadn't tried to stop him, he might never have bought the farmland. He might never have discovered how much people still longed for something real, something that connected them to the earth. As the seasons changed, the farm took on a rhythm of its own. Spring brought new planting, summer brought harvests, and autumn turned the fields golden. Every season had its own beauty. Jake's small roadside stand grew into a cozy wooden market where people could buy vegetables, honey, and homemade jams. His wife started baking fresh bread and selling it there too. By now, even the strictest HOA board members had softened. A few of them visited quietly, pretending they were just passing by, but they always left with full baskets and smiles. One evening, the HOA chair, the same man who had once told Jake to tear down his coop, stopped by the farm. He looked around at the fields, then at Jake and said, "You've done something special here." Jake didn't say much. He just nodded and replied, "Sometimes good things come from the things that go wrong." The man gave a small smile and said, "Maybe we all learned something." After he left, Jake stood there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air smelled of earth and grass, and the last light of the day painted the sky in shades of red and orange. He thought about the journey, the arguments, the fines, the frustration, and in how it had all led to this peaceful moment. The farm was more than a piece of land now. It was a symbol of what could happen when someone refused to give up on something honest and good. It reminded people that simple things, soil, seeds, sunlight, could still bring joy in a world full of rules and screens. Every now and then, Jake would drive around the neighborhood at night. He'd see lights shining through windows, families sitting down to dinner, and sometimes he'd notice a basket of vegetables on someone's porch, vegetables that had come from his farm. That always made him smile. He didn't do any of this to prove a point anymore. He did it because it felt right. Because in a world that often valued appearance over meaning, he had chosen to build something real. And though the HOA had once tried to stop him, it was now clear that what he had built couldn't be stopped. The land was alive again, and so were the people around it. The years passed quietly, and the farm became a part of the town's story. What had started as a personal dream turned into something bigger than Jake ever imagined. The land that once surrounded the neighborhood was now full of life, rows of crops, fruit trees, buzzing bees, and smiling faces. It wasn't just a farm anymore. It was a place where people gathered, shared stories, and found peace. Jake's hands had grown rough from years of work, but he didn't mind. Every scar, every callus told a story. He had built this place with his own 2 hands, 1 seed at a time. Some mornings he would stand at the edge of the fields and look back toward the neighborhood. The houses looked the same as before, tidy lawns, white fences, and clean driveways. But something in the air had changed. People were different now. They waved more. They talked to each other more. Even the HOA board had changed. Meetings were calmer, friendlier. They had started organizing community cleanups and small garden projects. Some residents even planted small patches of herbs and vegetables in their yards. What was once forbidden had now become a sign of pride. Jake never bragged about what he had done. He didn't need to. The land spoke for itself. The hum of bees, the laughter of children, and the scent of soil after rain were reminders of how far things had come. One spring afternoon, a group of students came to the farm again for a school visit. Jake greeted them with his usual smile, showing them around the fields. He loved watching their faces light up as they learned how food grew. One little girl picked a carrot straight from the ground and gasped when she saw the dirt fall off it. "It's real," she said, laughing. Jake chuckled and nodded. "Yes, everything good starts in the dirt," he said. After they left, Jake sat under the old oak tree near the market stand. The same tree where he and his wife often shared their evening tea. She joined him there with 2 cups, handing him one. "You've made something beautiful here," she said softly. He looked around at the farm, then at her. "We both did," he replied. "And so did everyone who believed in it." As the sun lowered, the golden light fell across the fields, making everything glow. Jake thought back to when it all began. The letters, the fines, the meetings, the frustration. Back then, he'd only wanted a few chickens and a small garden. He never imagined it would lead to this. It made him realize something important. Sometimes the hardest battles lead you exactly where you're meant to go. The struggle with the HOA hadn't been a punishment. It had been a push. Without it, he might never have found the courage to chase his dream. One day, the local newspaper came to interview him. The reporter asked, "What made you keep going when everyone told you to stop?" Jake smiled thoughtfully before answering, "I guess I just didn't want to live by someone else's idea of what's right. I wanted to live close to the land, to do something real. Sometimes you have to fight for that." The article spread quickly. People from other towns came to see the farm, and Jake was invited to speak at local events about sustainable living and community building. He wasn't used to the attention, but he spoke from the heart. "I'm not special," he would tell people. "I just didn't give up when it would have been easier to quit." The farm continued to grow, and so did its meaning. Jake's wife started organizing small weekend markets where local artists, bakers, and gardeners could sell their goods. It became a joyful event, music, laughter, and the smell of fresh bread filling the air. The farm had turned into the heart of the community. One evening, as Jake was closing up the farm stand, he noticed the same HOA chairman who had once ordered him to remove his chickens walking toward him. The man looked older now, but his expression was kind. "I thought I'd stop by," he said, holding out his hand. "I owe you an apology. We were too strict back then. I see now what you were trying to do." Jake shook his hand, smiling warmly. "It's all right. We were all just trying to do what we thought was best." The man looked out across the fields and said, "Funny thing, isn't it? You ended up improving the whole place. People love living here now because of this view." Jake laughed quietly. "I guess sometimes nature knows better than rules." When the man left, Jake watched him walk back toward the neighborhood. The porch lights were coming on one by one, and he could hear the faint sound of children playing in the distance. He felt grateful, not for winning, but for what had grown out of the struggle. That night, the sky was clear and the stars shone bright above the fields. Jake sat on his porch, his wife beside him, both of them wrapped in a soft blanket. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The quiet spoke louder than words. After a while, she said softly, "Do you ever miss the old city life?" Jake smiled. "Not for a second," he said. "Out there, everything moved too fast. Here, I get to see life grow every day. That's enough for me." A gentle wind swept through the fields, carrying the scent of blossoms. The land that had once been empty was now full of life. Crops swaying, fireflies blinking in the dark, and the soft hum of the night. In that moment, Jake realized something simple but true. Peace doesn't always come easy, but it always comes to those who work for it. He leaned back in his chair, looking up at the stars, and whispered, "It was all worth it." The farm stood as a quiet reminder that one person can make a difference even against a wall of rules and doubt. It wasn't about winning a fight anymore. It was about proving that life, real, growing, breathing life, always finds a way. Years later, people would still talk about Jake's story. They'd tell new residents about the man who turned conflict into creation, who turned rejection into roots. Children who grew up near the farm would come back as adults, telling their own kids, "I remember when this place first started." And somewhere in the middle of those green fields, where the soil was rich and the air smelled of rain, Jake's legacy lived on, not in money or fame, but in something far greater. It lived in the hands of those who planted seeds, in the hearts of those who learned from him, and in the land itself, which would keep growing long after he was gone, because in the end, Jake hadn't just built a farm, he had built a home for life to begin again.